Apologies about that. Hello, everyone, and thank you, Lauren. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this session. As Lauren said, we'll have the Q&A and chat box for you to tell us your questions and your thoughts. But we also have a Mentimeter that Lauren has linked in the chat box. So please do tell us your opinion about this topic, and we would love to hear from you. So now I'll just pass over the microphone to our director, Dr. Naoya Tsukamoto, here at the Asian Institute of Technology's Regional Research Center for Asia and the Pacific. I'll invite Naoya-san to speak now. Thank you. And again, we'll have the Mentimeter open throughout the session, so do let us know your thoughts via that platform. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Good morning to everyone from Thailand. My name is Naoya Tsukamoto, Director of Regional Resource Center for Asia and the Pacific, Asian Institute of Technology. On behalf of RRC.AP, I would like to extend my warm welcome to all of you to whom participate in this session today. I would like to express my gratitude to the distinguished speakers for today's session. Ms. Christy Nozawa from the Samdala Institute, Dr. Peter King from the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies, Professor Mario Tabcanon, Emeritus Professor at the Asian Institute of Technology, Mr. Yosef Zahar from the Stockholm Environmental Institute, Mr. Patrick Jasper from India's National Bank for Agriculture and Rural Development, Ms. Eloise Burnett of the Carbon Trust Singapore, and Dr. Demeritio Innocenti from the Green Climate Fund Secretariat. I would also like to share with you that Stockholm Environmental Institute, along with the International Center for Integrated Mountain Development, has provided important inputs for us to design this session, and that the session is supported by the Ministry of the Environment of Japan. The current health and economic crisis after the COVID-19 pandemic are giving us understanding on how different groups of humans are differently affected. I would like to quote from the famous 8 principles of locally led adaptation that was introduced past January at the Climate Adaptation Summit, which said, we need to address structural inequalities faced by groups marginalized based on their gender identity, age, national origin, ethnic or religious backgrounds, disability, and others. The principles also stress the need for collaborated action and investment, predictable and easy access to finance, and investing in local capacities. I hope and believe that this session, How Can Finance Flows Steer Resilience Pathways That Truly Leave No One Behind, will contribute to promote these principles and empower participants intellectually. Regarding to empowerment, RRC.AP will open a new e-learning course in the next month. This course focuses on developing concept notes for the Green Climate Fund simplified approval process. For more information, please visit our virtual exhibition site in this APAN forum or our webpage. Okay, as it is my responsibility, let me proceed our agenda today. I'm very much pleased to share with you that we have 2 distinguished keynote speakers today. They have been working closely with stakeholders for many years and has rich experience in their own fields. The first speaker is Ms. Christy Nozawa, Executive Director of the Samdala Institute. She works with indigenous peoples along the region, including Indonesian Papua and islands of West Timor, for small-scale finance. I hope she would kindly share with us her experience and reflections in mobilizing investments to support indigenous people. Christy, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Naoya. Good morning, everyone. I'm assuming I'm on screen. Thank you for the organizers for inviting me to share my thoughts on climate finance. For those who are not familiar with Samdana, we are a Southeast Asian institute with offices in Bogor, Indonesia, and Cagayan de Oro in the Philippines, with a vision for a healthy, just, and culturally diverse region. We have been an alliance fund for Southeast Asia of the Global Green Grants Fund since 2003. Today, Samdana is also the national executive agency for the dedicated grant mechanism Indonesia under the Forest Investment Program of the Indonesia government. We have supported over 1,000 indigenous peoples, local communities, and civil society groups across the region for the past decades. And I'd like to share 5 lessons for you, with you from these experiences. Slides, please. Slide, please. These are the 5 lessons I want to share are: small is beautiful. Lauren, the slide, please. Innovation is needed to fund the unfundable. Flexibility is crucial. Our grant making is based on a chain of trust, and we invest in movement building. First lesson is that small is beautiful. For many donors, they find it easier to deal with big amounts rather than small amounts. Small is beautiful because this is bite-sized for many communities who may never have managed more than the poverty level income of $2 a day or $50 a month. More so, not the aggregated income for 50 to 100 families per community. We need to understand that communities have to be able to manage the size of the funds, and that bigger funds have the potential to choke them to death. So big amounts do not necessarily trickle down to those who have never had experience to manage big grants. This does not mean, though, that they cannot manage bigger funds. We just need to handhold communities better, invest in building their capacities to enable them to manage bigger amounts of funds as appropriate and needed. Second, is that innovation is needed to fund the unfundable. Many communities are not registered and therefore may not be fundable by many programs or donors' requirements. There are 2 ways we have dealt with this situation and condition. First is we can course the money through a financial conduit that is a registered entity. Second is that we use a system where a community is allowed to receive funds via the establishment of a dedicated bank account in the nearest financial facility in their area. This is established by the community agreeing to have 2 signatories to the account who will be accountable to them. This process is facilitated through a local community facilitator. The third lesson is that flexibility is crucial. We have different kinds of grants for different needs based on inputs from our partners. Each of these grants have different requirements. We do not believe in one size fits all kind of administration or finance system in grant making. We develop different mechanisms for different needs and conditions. For example, Samdana currently manages an urgent action fund from as small as $500 to as much as $3,000. Still very small by many donor standards. But this fund provides support for life and death situations for environmental defenders and indigenous people, local communities at risk. This fund may be provided to organize fact-finding teams, legal defense, and provide urgent food and water needs for people's survival when regular relief efforts have not yet reached a community affected by man-made or natural disaster. We provide support within 24 hours of the request being received and do not require long proposals nor reports for this amount. But we are able to do this only because we invest in trust building. Third lesson is that our grant making is based on a chain of trust. Trust is an essential element for the relationships with our partners. The assumption by which we operate is that people are not naturally corrupt nor have bad intentions. We spend time and energy to develop trust between us and our partners. We spend time to know our partners, build relationships beyond the project, beyond the funds. We work to ensure an open communication line that is not judgmental of our partners' intentions or actions. We follow a chain of trust involving volunteer advisors and continuing to learn from our partners and listening to them. We rely on the intelligence from volunteer advisors who knows these communities, have worked with them, provide their time and talent to ensure appropriate and timely support reaches these groups. And we also continue to grow this network of volunteer advisors. Lastly, we have to invest in movement building. We know that development and resiliency building is not just project-based, and we are in partnership with different groups and organizations for the longer term. We are in partnership beyond the funds that we provide. Sometimes, fund is not what is needed, but someone to listen, discuss, share windows of opportunities, linkages, information, networking with other organizations, capacity building, or something else. We sustain our relationships with as many of our partners even as they are not currently receiving funds or support from us. We consider them part of the bigger community and critical mass to combat climate change. Climate finance has to create pathways beyond funds to ensure that no one is left behind. It has to create webs of relationships for the development of a social and environmental movement needed to effectively address climate change impacts and build longer-term resiliency. This movement building aspect of climate finance will also allow us to reach and mobilize those who are not normally reachable, thousands of indigenous peoples and local communities, tens of thousands of women, millions of young people from these marginalized communities across Asia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christy, for your crystallized experience of Sandana on the 5 lessons. I'm so much impressed. Thank you very much. So now I would like to introduce Dr. Peter King, Senior Advisor at the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies. He has over 50 years of experience working closely with stakeholders on climate change adaptation planning, including his career in the Asian Development Bank. I'm so much interested in listening to his experience and reflection. Peter, you have the floor, please.
Good. Thank you very much, Tsukamoto-san, and thank you for inviting me to this session. In a recent presentation by my colleagues at the Asian Development Bank, it was suggested that the Asia-Pacific region needs about $26 trillion in investment in infrastructure by 2050. And based on an assessment of what proportion of that funding needs to go into climate proofing, it would need about $2 to $3 trillion to climate proof infrastructure alone in the region, even before we begin to calculate the costs of ecosystem protection and restoration, food and water security, and livelihood protection. A pertinent question, therefore, is where will all this money come from? Those of you who are listening to Salim Huq earlier, he said that it's time to move all of the climate finance into national sectoral budgets. and not only rely on dedicated climate finance, particularly from external sources. But are we ready to prepare the climate change adaptation projects that will allow us to continue to develop and thrive within this region? And even more pertinently, who will decide on which projects to finance first? As it's abundantly clear that there is not enough climate finance at present, nor will there be in the near future. So what are the obligations for stakeholder inclusion in this prioritization process? Well, I defy you to find any presentation on climate finance that says decisions on climate finance should only be top down by politicians or senior government officials and need not involve the key stakeholders. The Paris Agreement, for example, is a legally binding document, and it states that parties acknowledge that adaptation action should follow a country-driven, gender-responsive, participatory, and fully transparent approach, taking into consideration vulnerable groups, communities, and ecosystems. Now, in general, preparation of the nationally determined contributions has followed this global obligation. Take my host country's example. Thailand's INDC was developed through a participatory process. Stakeholder consultations were conducted through establishment of an interministerial working group and a steering committee comprising representatives from relevant sectoral agencies, academia, and the private sector. In addition, 3 national consultations were held during the technical analysis phase. Now, similarly, preparation of the national adaptation plans also demands inclusive participation. For example, the least developed countries expert group technical guideline for the NAP process states that the ranking of climate risks should be a product of consultative processes. And most importantly, given the fact that this ranking will determine the priorities for action in the future, it's crucial that the ranking be subject of as broad a consensus as possible, including among the general public. So what about stakeholder inclusion in practice? Well, as most publicly funded adaptation is going to be in the form of projects or programs, is this consensus on inclusive public participation being carried right down to the project level? A civil society organization guideline recently regarding public engagement in the Green Climate Fund stated, and I quote, "What we see so far in many countries, however, is very little civil society engagement with national governments in relation to climate finance and the GCF." And in fact, the February 2021 independent evaluation of GCF's adaptation portfolio found that countries with strong NDAs, which can engage many stakeholders and bring projects through the long design and proposal stage, actually have more adaptation projects by the GCF. But generally, there is a lack of sufficient formal participation of civil society organizations, private sector, indigenous peoples, and vulnerable communities in the business model, particularly at the project level during preparation and during implementation. And therefore, the GCF should encourage nationally designated authorities to make the project process more inclusive, and particularly to require international accredited entities to perform better in this respect. And as the GCF was set up as a relatively new institution based on a polycentric governance model, it's suspected that other more established climate finance institutions also have a long way to go in empowering public participation at all stages of the project cycle. Now, let me close by offering my personal experience in the NAP process and over 50 years experience in preparation of multiple adaptation projects for the GCF, GEF, and multilateral development banks. To be frank, inclusive public participation is much easier to say than to do. And if you don't recognize the time and costs of making the process as inclusive, as well as the ultimate costs of not making the process inclusive, then projects are often set up for failure, or at the very minimum, will not be sustainable once the project duration ends. My favorite example was a 12-year integrated area development project in water-scarce West Timor, where we built 75 small dams, put fences around the dams, and piped water into the villages. This was highly successful and was rated such at the end of the project and had major health benefits and income benefits for the villagers. One group that we forgot to include in the long consultation phase, however, was upstream cattle farmers. Over time, they saw water in the dams, cut the fences, and allowed their cattle to drink from the dams. The cattle, in turn, broke the pipes leading to the villages, and no one had the resources to repair the fence or the pipes as the project funding had finished. It was a very good lesson to me in how to turn a very good adaptation project into a failure. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Peter. In particular, you introduced us examples of the efforts for inclusiveness through, for example, through bridging the gaps between the national agenda and local priority. Thank you very much. Now, we will start the panel discussion. I would like to ask Professor Mario Tabbuchanan, Emeritus Professor of AIT, to kindly moderate this session. Professor Mario, please take the floor.
Thank you very much, Dr. Naoya Tsukamoto. And hello, everyone. It is a great pleasure to be serving as your moderator for the panel discussion. Now, before we start, I have one announcement to make, that we have some opinions from the audience via Mentimeter. And let's see what you think about how we are doing. So having said that, let me start by saying that today we have distinguished speakers joining from across the region and across different institutions with different experiences in mobilizing resources for resilience building. I am very honored to introduce them to you. First, we have Eloise Burnett joining from the Singapore office of Carbon Trust. She manages the UK government's ASEAN Low Carbon Energy Program, working across the region to drive energy efficiency and green finance. We also have Yusuf Zahar joining from the Bangkok office of the Stockholm Environment Institute, where he focuses on climate finance and the role of private finance in addressing communities, mitigation, and adaptation challenges in developing Asia Pacific. We also have Patrick Jasper joining from Mumbai's head office of India's National Bank for Agriculture and Rural Development. He has over 20 years of experience supporting activities in rural regions of India and mobilizing finance from the GCF, Adaptation Fund, and the National Adaptation Fund for Climate Change and others. And last but certainly not least, from Songdo, Korea's headquarters of the Green Climate Fund, we have Demetrio Innocente. He manages the GCF's simplified approval process, project preparation facility, and enhancing direct access pilot at the GCF, all of which aim to support developing countries, accelerate and scale resilience activities. A warm welcome to all, and thank you for your time and sharing your insights. I ask each panelist to limit your inputs to 5 minutes, maximum 5 minutes, in the interest of time. Now, we have heard the keynote messages from Christy and Peter, their reflections. Now, let us start by considering your view, panelists' view, on the role of climate finance to increase and accelerate inclusive resilience. Now, here is the question. Based on perceived good and bad practices in climate finance, what are key barriers and enabling conditions for finance institutions to increase social inclusion in adaptation practices? And also, please give some recommendations. Now, Yusuf, let's start with you. Based on your research and experience across the region, can you share your reflections on how private finance and investments, in particular, are facing barriers? And what are some of the key opportunities for private sector finance to lead the way in inclusiveness? Yusuf, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, everybody, and I hope that that I'm heard well. I'm very honored to participate in this session, and it has been. I just like briefly to talk about SEI's activities in the region, and we have been focusing over the past few years on actually trying to see how climate finance reaches vulnerable communities. So the example provided before by Mr. King with regards to financing of hydropower plants, for instance, would be one aspect. But we currently try to look at really the small scale projects, the communities, the small farmers. How could those actually receive climate finance? And I will direct my answer to those areas. So the challenges are quite, are very substantial, of course, and they come from various aspects. We need to bring a private sector finance at scale, but it is actually not making its way. So the small farmer who needs to make the transition, the small enterprise will not be receiving finance coming from the international community, climate finance, and will not usually be getting the support it needs. There are issues which for the international investors make, I would say, a break or make situation, and one of them is risk-return balance. And there's simply a lack of return versus the risk that those actually projects are provided. There is also lack of accessibility to, I would say, assigning a risk to those communities. So if finance has to make its way to those communities, we need to assign a certain risk. And this is pretty much impossible. I mean, everybody's talking about the debt capital markets and they invested rated bonds, but how can we rate a bond if we have a community to rate? So how do we rate those communities? So this is one major barrier, and of course we need to have also standard reporting for investors, which is actually not there for this sector. So if we are making this transition, adaptation efforts, how is that impact measured and brought very in a straightforward way to investors? And that is also very it is not there at the moment for this type of investments. And also there needs to be some very important policy changes, and we need to support the communities. I mean, we cannot make this transition without providing them the support, and also policy barriers such as flow of funds. Sometimes funds cannot make its way from capital markets to those to actually countries or financial institutions, and all of that needs to be changed. Also, with regards to private sector participation, usually they are not actually they're not working with capacity building or technical assistance support, but simply, unless we are talking about impact funds, but simply providing funds as a transaction. But that by itself is not sufficient. We need a major effort in actually capacity building and technical assistance. As for the opportunities, and I will touch that briefly, once this is solved, the opportunity is immense. So we are talking about a mass transition, a mass demand coming for smart agriculture, for insurance, micro-insurance products, for in a range of sectors which all relate to adaptation and resilience. So the opportunities is in the billions, and therefore the trillions which were referred to before for what is actually required for projects. By, I think ADB was quoted. So a lot of that, of course, has to go to those areas where we develop the small stakeholders, and especially related to smart agriculture. So thank you very much, and I pass back the floor to you.
Mario, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Thank you very much, Yusuf, for such a splendid explanation. Now let's get some thoughts from someone managing a program engaging with industry while considering smaller businesses and minority groups across Southeast Asia, including fishing communities in the Mekong region. Eloise, I understand that your work at the Carbon Trust Singapore includes supporting initiatives which are cross-cutting climate change mitigation and adaptation. So what have you learned about the overlap between climate, gender, financing, and what is your work doing to further this agenda? What have you learned about building the business case for integrating a gender lens in climate financing? You have the floor, Eloise.
Thank you, Mario, and thank you for having me here today. I really feel like I'm building upon the words of Yusuf here. So hopefully many of you will be familiar with what it is to apply a climate lens to your business and investments as a central pillar for ESG reporting. But how and why should climate and gender be considered at the same time? At Carbon Trust, our work is mainly focused on green finance. We work with both corporates and the public sector. We are genuinely trying to tackle the greenwash. So looking at data scarcity and the practicalities of integrating green measures into business, while also driving and pushing green finance to become even more mainstream than it is. We have investment and finance experience to ensure that when we're talking about green finance, it is actually genuinely delivering green outcomes. So when it comes to gender and climate change together, there are practical and developmental reasons to bring these topics together. Considering both climate and gender in investments has the potential to deliver for your business, for the women, and also for pushing the UN sustainability goals. This is because climate change will hit women and girls hardest. It hits those who are already the most disadvantaged the most. It deepens poverty. Because of existing social, cultural, and economic disadvantages, it's going to disproportionately affect women and girls. So to merge the gender and climate investment agenda is essentially to improve our response to climate change, but also delivering social justice at the same time. And the thing is when we talk about this, we're not talking about it like it's a negative thing. This is just smart investment. Business case is strong. The statistics speak for themselves. So those who are not considering climate change and how it will affect their business operations, the productivity of their assets, the resilience of their assets, are already increasingly seen as laggards. The same can be said for in considering gender in your investments in your business operations. The statistics speak for themselves. Companies with at least 30% women executives outperform those with lower women representation. Venture and private equity funds with a gender balanced team have a 20% higher return than their peers. So how do you actually build in gender considerations? How can we bring a gender lens to investments that mitigate climate change, and vice versa? How do you bring a climate lens to gender smart investments? So incorporating gender and climate analysis into your practices of investment includes evaluation of how value is assigned, how relationships are structured, and how the processes work. If you are investing into climate businesses, you can bring gender into your due diligence process, doing a deep dive and asking businesses, where are the women? What are they doing? How are your business models impacting women and girls? Or how are the products and services that you offer impacting the community? So we support financial institutions to identify and define which assets and activities are considered green, and at the same time, these can be evaluated for gender impact. Under the ASEAN Low Carbon Energy Programme, the UK government aid programme we run with EY and IMC worldwide, we are pushing this agenda. We recently supported the publication of the Gender Smart Climate and Gender Working Group report, which is titled Gender and Climate Investment, the Strategy for Unlocking a Sustainable Future. This document and report tries to demystify this gender smart climate finance topic, trying to kind of frame the thinking around climate finance and gender finance, and trying to inspire more investors to get involved. We're also looking at partnering with the International Institute of Sustainable Development to try and develop a how-to guide to try and tackle this quite impenetrable subject, and trying to disseminate this as far as we possibly can. So essentially, to be considering climate and gender together is actually just thinking long-term. It's actually just being considerate of the implicit long-term risk and values for your own investments. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Eloise, for such a clear explanation. Now let's travel to the South Asian region. Patrick, NABARD, that's the name of your organization, National Bank for Agriculture and Rural Development. It is one of the most experienced direct access entities in the region in mobilizing international climate finance, but building at the same time on national and more local efforts. So what can we learn from India's experience so far on driving and accelerating inclusive resilience via finance flows? Patrick, you have the floor, please.
Yeah, hi, good morning, Dr. Mario. I hope I'm audible and on the screen.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So it's been a pleasure. It's a pleasure to be here. I would like to thank the RRC for inviting me to be on this panel, distinguished panel. It's been an interesting 4 days at the forum. It's always interesting to listen to people like Dr. King and Dr. Huck, who actually give us inputs and challenge the way we're doing things, you know, and first to ask the question, are we doing enough? So as Dr. Baidu said, I work for the National Bank for Agriculture and Rural Development. We call it NABARD for short here in India. So NABARD operates across the country to promote agriculture and rural development through credit interventions as well as development activities. So we are a sort of a financial institution from the development perspective, one of the few remaining in the world, I guess. As far as climate change is concerned, we have been the national implementing entity of the Adaptation Fund for quite a long time, I believe since July 2012. We are also the direct access entity of the Green Climate Fund, and we are also the national implementing entity of our own Government of India's National Adaptation Fund for Climate Change. So we have a adaptation fund which is operated through a budgetary support from the Government of India here in India. So as you may be aware, India is one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change. Global Watch has placed us in its recent report. Global Watch has placed us as the 7th most vulnerable in the world as far as climate is concerned. The estimated losses that our country face are around 13.8 billion US dollars, which has a negative impact on agriculture, especially in our country. 2/3 of our population lives in rural India, and they depend for livelihood directly or indirectly on agriculture. Out of the total area under agriculture, almost 55% is rain-fed. When I say rain-fed, I mean it depends. The farmers in those areas depend directly on the monsoon. So if the monsoon fails, if there's a drought, if there's a flood, then the agriculture is directly affected. Hence, they are extremely vulnerable and directly affected by climate change. So under such a situation, finance is critical, and I cannot stress that enough. So for such a huge country, the estimates suggest that India requires 2.5 trillion US dollars for mitigation and adaptation measures, of which adaptation requires just more than 200 billion US dollars just up to 2030 for the agriculture RL sector alone. So if you see, these are huge figures, and although India has taken a proactive stance with respect to meeting the challenges of climate change, over the years we have been pioneering our effects, our response to climate change. We launched our National Action Plan, the NAPCC, quite early in 2009, I believe. We launched several core missions which actually promote our response. For example, the National Solar Mission, the National Water Mission, the National Green Mission for Green India, the National Mission for Sustainable Agriculture. So all these have been launched through budgetary support through the government. We set up the National Clean Energy and Environment Fund. We have set up the National Adaptation Fund for Climate Change. We have launched the International Solar Alliance. We have measures like soil health cards. We promote organic farming. So these are all measures which the government has taken in order to fulfill the aspirations of the people, as well as to meet climate change head on. So if you see the climate finance architecture in India, the UNFCCC financial mechanism through Adaptation Fund, the Green Climate Fund, and GEF is promoted directly and through NABARD as the implementing entity. We also have UNDP, UNEP, FAO, and multilateral agencies like the Asian Development Bank who support us through directly without outside the UNFCCC, UNFCCC mechanism. We have multilateral and bilateral arrangements with agencies like the GIZ, like KFW, like JICA, like USAID, who provide us support on different projects. We also have our regional funds. I was telling you about the National Environmental Fund, National Adaptation Fund, and state budget allocation. When India launched its National Action Plan for Climate Change, all our states, all our regional centers had their own state action, so that the states could identify priorities with respect to climate change. So at the moment, if you look at our climate change portfolio as far as NABARD is concerned, which we operate on behalf of the Government of India, we have 6 projects under the Adaptation Fund worth about 9.8 million US dollars. I think we've almost reached our contact with respect to Adaptation Fund. We have 2 projects under the Green Climate Fund worth about 134 million US dollars. This is a mix of both mitigation as well as adaptation. And we have 30 projects worth around 130 million US dollars under our own local fund, the National Adaptation Fund for Climate Change. So if you see the range of activities that we support, it includes climate smart villages, climate smart agriculture, soil water conservation, renewable energy, sustainable livelihoods, forests, biodiversity, land degradation, and livestock and fisheries management. So apart from this, we also have a huge portfolio of ecosystem-based adaptation activities, like our sustainable watershed.
I would
Yes.
I would very much appreciate if you can wrap up your
Yeah, so
intervention. Thank you.
sure. So at the moment, climate tracker, I was looking at the climate tracker website yesterday. So it says that in India's NDCs, which stipulate that we reduce the emission density by 33% and all the other measures, they say that we are on track to achieve a 2-degree world, but for 1.5-degree world. So the keyword here is finance. So although the NDC is on track, if we have to achieve, this applies to all other countries. If we have to achieve the 1.5-degree world that is stipulated in the Paris Agreement, this is conditional on increased funding for both mitigation and action activities. For a country the size of India and its myriad problems, increased funding is the key to effective adaptation. Thank you. I'll stop there.
That was great, Patrick. Thank you very much. And now let's travel to Korea, where Dimitrio's team is working seamlessly to work within the fabric of the UNFCCC's financial mechanism to support transformative climate action. Now, Dimitrio, can you share your reflections from your experience and observations on how climate finance is and can better drive social inclusion? The floor is yours, Dimitrio.
Thank you, Mario. I hope you can all hear me well. And
Yes.
I will be very, I can be very brief because I had the privilege to talk last, and so many things have already been said by the previous panelists, by Christy and by Peter. Look, maybe the question is also how social inclusion can better drive climate finance, because maybe I like to see more in that perspective. Very briefly, let's say there are, from a donor perspective, from someone that in fact come from an institution that do investments in climate change project and has to consider how social inclusion is embedded into that. I would say there are two levels here, and I think the point have already been made by Christy from on one side and Peter. First, we have to look at the level of the institution that receive our climate finance. Are they having the right track record? Are they having, in fact, policies, streamlined policies on gender, on social impact assessments, on considering the issue around indigenous people, minority, vulnerable groups into the regular, let's say, way to carry out business, to design projects. So there is, first of all, when we want to understand how climate finance social inclusion and vice versa, we should look at who manage this climate finance from the donors, have the right track to do so, because they have the right policies and the right experience to do so. The second aspect is what has been already said at project level. We need to have a view if there is a whole of society approach behind it that in fact identifies those drivers of change at a community level, especially in adaptation project. And by the way, this is what the GCF Enhanced Indirect Access CDA is trying to do. Identify the right drivers of change that put the interest of the most vulnerable group at the center. So our women's group consulted, the small business consulted, local governments, community-based organizations, CSOs, understanding how their inputs have been put in the driving seat to design, especially adaptation proposal. It's a key element for us to understand if we can have this climate finance driving social inclusion in a way that give climate finance project, climate change project more impact. Because if we don't have social inclusion, we can consequently not have a meaningful impact at the end of the day. Over to you, Mario.
Thank you very much, Dimitrio. Now that ends the first round, the first segment of the panel discussion. Many thanks to all of you for your insights. Now in the next round, allow me to pick your brains in a rather sprint manner because of the the length of the questions. We have a two-folded question, and the question is, what are the key approaches, tools, and levers for adaptation practitioners to leverage inclusive stakeholder engagement and representation in resilience building? And the second part is, how can inclusive participation be leveraged to attract more direct and diverse finance and investments for resilience at the local level? And please also give some recommendations. So I will start with Eloise. You have the floor. Can we start with you, please, with that question?
Yes, absolutely. So from my area of work, I really am on a daily basis on the ground trying to deliver some impacts with the program that we run with the UK ASEAN Low Carbon Energy Program. And what we've done in that program is we've designed the program to ensure that everything that we're doing under energy efficiency and green finance is inclusive. And this requires us to have some key tools. So first of all, first of all, our funder, the UK government, has made it compulsory. So we have to have the gender and inclusion requirement built in. It's one of our KPIs. We are checked in on a monthly basis. It is a requirement to make sure that everything that we do is inclusive, and it makes people take it seriously. Those who don't naturally think these things through have to take it seriously. We've also had to define what inclusion means in a really specific way, because if you're working in green finance and energy efficiency, the entry point of these often really technical subjects is not always that obvious. We had to intentionally extend the definition of gender inclusion to include micro-organizations, so not just SMEs, MSMEs, so that the smallest organizations don't get left behind in the energy transition. When we're talking about green finance, people get focused on the big ticket items, green sovereign bonds, for example. Or if you're thinking about energy efficiency and energy saving and energy adaptation, it's all about the huge industrial plants and machinery, because they're the ones that are going to have the biggest impact. But we've been pushed, and we constantly push about the smarter solutions that are inclusive of all businesses. So what about on-bill leasing, where you lease products to small companies and they pay back installments taken from their energy bills? What about aggregating projects that are working with small companies so that they become a more attractive investment option? And we're also looking at smart energy efficiency finance mechanisms that tap into the rise in smartphone usage. So we had to adapt the inclusion framework to include entry points ranging from social safeguarding, economic empowerment, and all pointing towards what we hope is transformational change. So in practical terms, what does this actually mean for a program on the ground? So we explicitly reach out to women, MSMEs, microfinance institutes on every project. We are running over 40 active projects in ASEAN right now. So touching upon a huge range of subjects, trying to push this agenda that's around policy, technical assistance, capacity building. Are we considering how financial policy is going to impact different social groups? Is the capacity building that we are developing aimed at the right groups? We have on-the-ground support from national gender and inclusion experts who know and can make linkages with women's organizations. People that are representing MSMEs or MFIs, and actually getting a local perspective from the countries that we're working in. And also due diligence, I've said it before, but it's about if we're working with a corporate, are they using gender safeguarding policies? Do they have a modern slavery risk assessment? Those practical policy elements that ensure that you are working with the right type of organization. And if those policies are not in place, we're doing hand-holding advice to try and get them in place and providing that capacity building using our GNI experts. So just to dive really, really quickly into a project that we're doing on the Mekong Delta. So in Vietnam, we're working with 3 seafood companies trying to push their energy saving agenda, trying to identify energy efficiency projects for investment. What we know, if these companies, these SMEs, are spending less on their energy, it means that they can free up capital for other things. They can spend more on business development. They can produce more. They can support the community in a stronger way. And we hope that by supporting those SMEs, what we will see is that it will boost the community and therefore have maximum impact on women and other vulnerable groups. So, and hopefully through that, we can develop case studies and create a network where other fisheries can see what the benefit has had.
Thank you very much, Eloise. Now, Demetrio, what do you think is working and what isn't from your own perspective on the GCF's young life in driving investments that meet the needs of the recipient? Would you please share with us, Demetrio?
Thank you again, Mario. Well, first, you are right. The GCF is young, is a Pervin project since only the end of 2015. What it means that basically even the oldest project that we have approved currently are at the final stage of implementation at best. So judging today what is working, what is not, it's difficult. I think it would be difficult also for these independent evaluations that Peter just mentioned at the beginning. We need more time to really fully reply to your question, Mario. So let's maybe look from another perspective, what it works, what it doesn't. When we evaluate ex ante, when we decide if to invest or not in a climate change project as the GCF, in terms of looking at needs of the recipient, let's start to say that needs of the recipient, it's indeed one of the 6 investment criteria that we use at the GCF in order to recommend or not to our board to approve a project. And so we really look that needs of the recipients are addressed. And what it means? Well, it means that when one of the accredited entity, I mean, organizations that can bring project to the GCF bring a project, we really look at questions like, okay, how the communities, how the most vulnerable people in this community benefit from this climate change project, how in fact there is a clear beneficiary profiling that tell us how those that are most vulnerable are going to benefit most, how this is conceptualized through a theory of change. We look at aspect as, okay, we understand that there is an assessment of how the vulnerable assets of these people is exposed to climate change and what the project does. We look at aspects also of needs of the beneficiaries as institution. I mean, also the institution in developing countries are beneficiary of the climate finance that we provide. So how our finance can strengthen local government, empower communities, empower women's group, empower small business to adapt and be more resilient in the long term. And what is working, what is not working? I think what is working is that these are definitely probably the right angle to, among other criteria, of course, to understand if we are spending our climate finance better. So I think what is working is that we definitely got the criterion needs of the beneficiary right as ex ante investment criteria for GCF project. What is not working? Well, I would say that probably the level of granularity that in any case we can have ex ante is limited. And probably we should have more attention that this type of investment criteria is checked by midterm evaluation, final evaluation, very carefully by our stakeholders, the accredited entity, the independent evaluation. Normally there is a lot of attention on value for money, on impact, on paradigm shift that is actually achieved, efficiency, effectiveness, and this is all very, very important. But we need also to spend a lot of time to focus on how these needs of the recipient potential that was evaluated when we invested that actually translated in making a difference in the life and livelihoods of the people on the ground. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Demetrio. Thank you. And let's move to Patrick. Patrick, in your experience working in tribal and rural communities from a national level, what are your reflections on enabling conditions to increase inclusion in the conversation and mobilization of finance flows? You have the floor, Patrick.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Mario. So actually, we follow sort of a targeted approach. The country is so big, the beneficiaries are so big, and the requirements are also very large. They're large and different. So different regions have different requirements. So we try and follow a targeted approach where we try and identify the target areas and communities based on the requirements of the intervention. We try to identify these requirements as and when they are required, and the time frame. For example, if it's a subsidy scheme or an income guarantee scheme, we make sure the small farmers benefit rather than the farmers. So it's, for example, a ration scheme. We make sure it is those at the poverty line or below the poverty line who get the maximum benefit. So as a funding agency, we follow this principle of targeted approach. I can give you one example. For example, we have this watershed development projects across the country. We also have 500 plus districts. So how do we actually select which district is most vulnerable? So we have a rain-fed priority index developed by some of our technical institutes, agriculture institutes. So we use this index. We classify the districts based on this index, and once we identify the districts which are most vulnerable, we then go to the community. A lot has been said on community participation. This is one of the major interventions that we can. We engage with the communities, we talk to them, we tell them the requirements, we tell them the gender integration that has to be done, we tell them about the monitoring evaluation that has to be done. All these conditions are explained, and if they are willing, we even ask them to do a pilot before we start the main project, so that we know how transparent this community is, how united the community is. So, the targeted approach and integration to the community is what we combine both these things to make sure that it is the vulnerable, most vulnerable of the population that actually gets benefit to these finance flows. Yes, Dr. Mario, thank you. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. And Yusuf, one of the biggest challenges in adaptation is mobilizing private investments. Are there any points in which you think private finance can steer the boat for more inclusion? You have the floor, Yusuf.
Thank you very much. Well, I think that eventually that would be the game changer. I mean, if private finance would steer in the transition, and that eventually, I mean, when you look at asset owners, if it's pension funds or insurance companies, I mean, eventually when it comes down to what they demand of their investments, eventually this will happen on the ground. So the way I view it, it's at the moment, I mean, we need to, it's kind of a two-stream work where investors need to understand the product. Investor needs to understand where to invest on the ground and what is being actually, what does it mean to invest in communities. And on the other hand, they also need to understand the inclusiveness. What does it mean to have to actually involve the community, and what actually ideas could come out of there. And once those products are actually designed, once those projects take scale and investments could come into place, this should be embedded in the investments criteria. So at the moment, if you look at the impact fund investments, then that would usually be the case. But what about mainstream investors? I mean, so all of these criteria, and I would say ESG or other standards which are there, we'll have to adapt when it comes to investments in those areas, which are completely different than investments in infrastructure. And then that would, as well as policy changes and policy demands, that would be the game changer for in fact those investments and inclusiveness. So this is not regular investment. I mean, this is we have to understand that, and therefore dedicated tool needs to be developed really for greater inclusiveness, and we need to educate stakeholders, financial stakeholders, not only investors, but the entire financial ecosystem needs to be educated to understand this actually evolving asset class that will become very large. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yusuf. Now we have ended the second round, and let's open the floor to the audience. We have 2 questions. We limit round by round questions to 2 in the interest of time. We have here a question from Sarkar, and the question is, how can the challenges of limited funding, misuse, and mismanagement of donor funding in developing countries can be addressed? So one of you may take this question. Maybe Patrick, can you respond to this question?
Yes, Dr. Mario. Okay, I've actually responded in line also, just for the information of the House. I can talk about our experience. So we have a very structured monitoring evaluation procedure we follow. So we have monitoring at 3 levels, at the field level, at a district level, and at the state level. I believe that monitoring and evaluation is an important factor which ensures transparency in the field, the utilization of funds by the project agencies, in the selection of beneficiaries. And one more factor which I cannot stress enough is the involvement of the community, ownership by the community. So if we actually allow the community build their capacities to actually manage their own projects, they see the benefits of that. So on the one side, we have robust monitoring mechanism by the funding agency or by the implementation agency, and self-monitoring by the community, because they realize the actual benefits of the project. For that, capacities have to be built, and this is how we sort of ensure that. But like Dr. King was saying, it's easier said than done. So these are things that we promote, and sometimes, yes, things do happen on the field, but by and large, we see that these tools combined effectively ensure transfer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Very clear answer. Thank you. The second question is as follows: how can climate finance be handled to ensure equity in distribution of funds among countries? I think this is perhaps addressed to Demetrio. Can I ask Demetrio to respond, please?
Yeah, thank you, Mario. It's very quite complex question, I think, and I've been in several discussions on climate justice when it comes to this concept on how we ensure equity. A straightforward answer, it's basically that when we look at a proposal that asks climate finance, as I mentioned before, we have to look at the end who is the beneficiary, and ensure that we understand well that before doing that investment, the most vulnerable part, the social inclusion we discussed so far, it's clearly there, that there is in any case recognition that different groups, because of gender, because of religion belief, because of disability, because of ethnic reasons, you name it, are de facto disadvantaged and more at risk than other because of the current and even more future impact of climate change. And there must be an answer to how this is going to be dealt by a project that need climate finance from a donor, in the first place, the GCF. So there must be attention to these aspects when a decision on the investment is taken. But then, as mentioned by Peter, as mentioned by Patrick, then we also have to have strong monitoring and evaluation systems when we do this implementation. We should have system that even empower the beneficiary to report on their own achievement, or projects that have redress mechanisms so that the voice of those that feel that they have been excluded, in any case, are heard by the decision maker on the finance that is given, and so on. These are all aspects that I think today, compared probably to the classic more development finance that was going on 20 or 30 years ago, are more measured. And we have also the advantage of technology, of digital system or mobile telephone that can give us also these tools to monitor that these equality aspects is actually not only a cosmetic level, but really happens during the implementation. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Demetrio. Now, in the interest of time, I would like to conclude the questioning by having one more, just one more, and I think it applies to all the panelists. I would like to invite the panelists to consider how those working within finance and investing can consider other enablers of inclusive resilience. As we know, finance and investing is only one enabler, but there are other enablers. So how do you deal with the other enablers in order to enhance and increase funding for inclusive resilience building? So it's a general question, but I think it applies to all the. This could be the closing statement, or just one. Just one. Anybody who would like to respond to that question? Maybe Eloise, can you?
Yeah, I think that's, I would be happy to respond to that. Thank you. So yeah, I feel like from the work that we do in this region and globally, climate and the investment and funding perspective is just one of the elements that we're working on. And I think collaborating across different parties and different stakeholders is hugely important. The case study that would be great to bring forward here, that it just highlights how we have to think wider than just the financial flows, is a piece of work we're doing in Thailand, where we're piloting a paid from savings business model with refrigeration models, where we are working with manufacturers of refrigerators who are interested in trying to increase access of their energy efficient products and to smaller institutions and smaller shops around the country. So we are doing a small pilot, which is going to create a working model of where you can use energy bills to pay for more efficient equipment. That pilot is then going to be something that we can take to the funding community. So we're doing the work in the front end, using local ESCOs, using suppliers to create this mechanism and this pilot. So that's an example where it's not always going to be the funding parties that move first. Others have to create the foundations and the infrastructure for the finance community to be more comfortable to act in these spaces.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Is it okay?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you all so very much for the fascinating, very fascinating discussion. We learned a lot from the experiences, the insights that you provided us. And we can make a summary maybe of what we have heard from all of you, a summarized version, that the inclusive resilience building, which is enabled by one of the great enablers of resilience, which is climate finance and investing, and using inclusive stakeholder engagement as a leverage. Now, Christy shared with us 5 lessons learned from the Samdana Institute's 5 years of experience working with often excluded groups, which are provision of small-scale finance, small is beautiful, innovation to reach quote-unquote unfundable groups, flexible financing, investing based on a chain of trust, and investing in movement building. So this were the message that we extract from the intervention of Rusty. Now, Peter King talked about inclusive public participation, which is a challenging process with its own costs, but non-inclusiveness often leads to project failure. That we must realize, or a lack of sustainability beyond a project's life. After the project is not the end, it's just the beginning. So what goes beyond the project life? Project developers need to make processes more inclusive. Now, we also learned from NABARD, this is Patrick's, finance needs are very large, and we need more finance, identifying most vulnerable groups based on assessments and notifying community stakeholders, while also working with the respective and specific mechanisms appropriate at the local context is very important. Demetrio, GCF, talked about considering how local inclusion can better drive climate finance. Funds investment criteria is very important, as he stressed, in outlining the expectations. Funds can improve in the granularity and monitoring of the management of finance and investments with regard to ensuring that the needs of the beneficiaries are inclusive. Eloise, Carbon Trust, talked about the need to acknowledge that women and girls are most affected by climate change and ensure that projects deliver justice and targeted finance to these groups. And she talked about the overlap of climate, gender, and financing. Yusuf EI talked about the lack of standard reporting for small farmers and communities, which limits delivery of finance at the small scale level, and the private sector needs to be boarded at local level and need policy changes that favors easy flow of funds, major efforts required in building capacities at local level, and providing technical assistance. Now, if we were to make a recommendation of all what we have heard, I think it's from engagement, community engagement, to empowerment, and how to make this realized is through capacity building. We have to build capacities of local citizens, local institutions, local stakeholders, including indigenous peoples, and addressing gender equity, adopting effective policies, because an enabling mechanism would be policy frameworks, for example, on climate adaptation, exploring and diversifying financing, co-financing, and of course, expanding the contribution of various sources, including the private sector. Now, when we talk about capacity building, I should provide maybe an addendum. Maybe it was not mentioned, but I should provide, coming from an academic institution, that higher education institutions, research institutions are also transforming themselves. They are not just dealing with education, not only with research, but they're opening their minds to reach out to communities, outreach. There are more and more efforts for action research, and then help build the competencies of members of the community. So I would like to suggest to also involve academic institutions if we talk about inclusiveness in engaging for the purpose of building inclusive resilience. So with that brief summary, I hope I encompass the messages that were shared by everyone. That concludes the panel discussion. And I would like to pass on the floor to Dr. Naoya Tsukamoto now to close this session. Dr. Tsukamoto, floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Mario. I'd like to thank you so much for your wonderful moderation. And I also thank to the other speakers for their valuable inputs. I hope that this session was fruitful for the participants and you enjoyed. It is our pleasure. So thank you very much again for your participation. And this is the end of the session. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all and goodbye.
Thank you all for attending today's session as part of the 7th Asia Pacific Climate Change Adaptation Forum. Please join us for the closing session of the forum, Scaling Up Action, beginning at 2 p.m. Bangkok time. Within the community, you can also explore the exhibitions as well as chat or set up meetings with other conference attendees. Join the conversation on social media using the hashtag APAN 2020.